What if fidelity is not a virtue, but a cage? What if the entire edifice of monogamy is less about love and more about control, a relic of what Nietzsche would call slave morality, the weak inventing chains to bind the strong? We are taught that a wife's loyalty is sacred, that her body and her gaze must orbit one man alone. But beneath this moral theater lies biology, desire, power. Foucault reminds us that relationships are never free of surveillance, that intimacy itself is structured like a prison, locked doors, guarded phones, whispered passwords. And Schopenhauer would add, desire once satisfied is only replaced by suffering, boredom, and the restless need for more. A cheating wife, then, is not simply breaking a promise. She is revolting against the invisible architecture of ownership, a rebellion against the prison of expectations. To call it betrayal is to accept the illusion that vows are stronger than instincts. But look closely. Freud's unconscious is always plotting. Jung's shadow is always whispering. A woman who cheats does not emerge from nowhere. She emerges from fractures long ignored, from needs unmet, from the anima's dark yearning. And here is the real shock. Infidelity may be less a crime against love than a crime against the myth of permanence. Sartre would say she is living in bad faith when she smiles and plays the role of the dutiful partner while her body hungers elsewhere. Yet in her deceit there is also a glimpse of authenticity, a raw will to power, to claim desire rather than perform virtue. Evolutionary psychology calls it dual mating strategy, the nesting partner and the thrilling outsider. But ideology calls it hypocrisy, sin, shame. So tonight we dive into the 9 hidden signs, not mere behavioral tics, but existential ruptures. Each sign is more than a clue to betrayal. It is a crack in the facade of order, an opening into chaos. Watch closely, because the signs of a cheating wife are never about lipstick on collars or secret texts. They are about the human spirit colliding with the walls society built around it. And once you see them, you cannot unsee them. The first sign is the shadow of secrecy. Not the trivial kind, hiding a phone under the pillow or clearing browser history, but the deeper psychological concealment that Jung described as the shadow. When a wife begins to veil parts of herself, not just her actions but her essence, something ancient stirs. She withholds not merely information but intimacy, creating a secret double life in the unconscious. Secrecy in this sense is not a tactic but a transformation. Foucault would say power thrives in what is hidden. The more one guards, the more power one feels. The locked phone becomes a totem, not because of what's inside, but because of the charged silence around it. This is the wife entering her own private kingdom, a realm where her husband has no jurisdiction. It is erotic precisely because it excludes him. Esther Perel calls this the paradox of desire. Eroticism needs distance, the unknown, the forbidden. Freud would insist secrecy is driven by repression, by unspoken wishes clawing to escape. Every half-truth, every delayed response, every faint smirk at a text message, these are not random quirks but eruptions of the unconscious. And evolutionary psychology supports it. Mate-guarding anxiety rises precisely when a partner senses secrets. The human animal is wired to detect it, to smell the tension, even if reason denies it. But here lies the ideological twist. Society tells us that transparency is the cure, that if only couples shared everything, betrayal would vanish. This is a lie. Total transparency is surveillance, not love. And secrecy, paradoxically, is what gives desire its oxygen. A cheating wife weaponizes this. She starves the relationship of disclosure so she can feast on the thrill of the hidden. The shadow is seductive because it is untouchable. Once secrecy takes root, even the simplest gesture, a locked screen, a private smile, becomes heavy with meaning. And when you notice it, you must ask, is this secrecy protecting me or protecting her hunger? But secrecy is only the seed. The next sign reveals itself not in what is hidden, but in what suddenly flourishes unnaturally before your eyes. The second sign is the bloom of excessive independence. At first glance, it seems admirable, even empowering. She no longer asks where you are going, no longer needs your presence to fill her evenings, no longer clings to the rituals that once bound you together. She proclaims freedom, reinvention, self-discovery. But as Nietzsche would remind us, behind every proclamation of freedom is the will to power, a reallocation of energy from one domain to another. When she withdraws her dependency, it is not neutral, it is conquest disguised as autonomy. Existentialists like Sartre saw this as bad faith masquerading as authenticity. She tells herself she is becoming her true self, but often this self is constructed in the gaze of another, the clandestine other. The gym memberships, the sudden late-night classes, the impulsive trips with friends, all carry the scent of reorientation. What looks like self-expansion is often, in fact, self-division. From an evolutionary perspective, this is strategy, shifting investment. A woman preparing to mate switch must first reduce reliance on the current partner. Psychologists studying attachment call it deactivation, dampening the emotional bond to create space for another. This detachment manifests as a sudden bloom of independence, a flourishing garden that grows suspiciously without your sunlight. But here lies the paradox. Independence is not inherently betrayal. In fact, Esther Perel insists that desire requires it, that mystery and space ignite erotic charge. Yet, in the context of secrecy, this independence transforms into a declaration of separation, a quiet but seismic cutting of the marital cord. It is not independence for its own sake, but independence that smells of exit strategy. The shocking truth is that society often cheers this bloom. She's finding herself, they say. She deserves her own life. And perhaps she does. But in the subterranean language of relationships, this sudden flourishing may be less about liberation than preparation, a rehearsal for stepping fully into another man's orbit. Independence without intimacy is not growth, it is departure. And when it blossoms too brightly, too suddenly, you are not witnessing evolution, you are witnessing substitution. But the bloom cannot remain unseen for long. The third sign erupts in the body itself, the primal canvas where desire leaves its most undeniable traces. The third sign is the transfigured body. The body is the most honest diary, even when the lips lie. Schopenhauer taught us that beneath reason and morality pulses the blind will to life, raw, erotic, reproductive. When a wife begins to cheat, her body is the first to betray her. Sudden attention to beauty, a new hairstyle, lingerie hidden in drawers, perfume that is never for you. It is not vanity, it is metamorphosis. Jung would call this the anima erupting into the physical realm, the projection of her secret desire sculpting her outward self. Freud would say the unconscious dresses for its audience, not its jailer. Who is she painting herself for? Who is she perfuming herself to attract? When the body shifts, it signals the spirit has already strayed. Evolutionary psychologists are blunt. Women in affairs often experience what researchers call the ovulatory shift. Subconsciously, they invest in appearance when pursuing or securing alternative mates. It is strategy etched into biology, mate value signaling, competitive ornamentation. The lipstick is not an accessory. It is an ancient flag of fertility raised in defiance of loyalty. But the real scandal lies in our denial of it. Society applauds self-care. She's just focusing on herself. But the timing of this transfiguration exposes the lie. Years of indifference suddenly replaced by an explosion of allure. It is not about self-love. It is about an audience you cannot see. Nietzsche would sneer at the delusion that this transformation is innocent. For him, the enhancement of the body is an act of will to power. Power over attention, over attraction, over the primal economy of desire. And here, the husband becomes merely the banker funding the stage where another man collects the dividends. The body cannot be silenced. When it glows for someone. And once you notice this radiance burning where it never burned before, you realize you are no longer the sun. You are the spectator to a body orbiting another star. But desire never stops at the body. The next sign is written not in flesh, but in the shifting tides of conversation, where silence becomes louder than words. The fourth sign is the erosion of dialogue. Words once abundant now collapse into silence or superficial chatter. Where there was once confession, now there is evasion. Sartre called this bad faith, the performance of roles instead of authentic communication. She answers questions with fragments, redirects the conversation, or cloaks everything in the language of busyness. The dialogue between you and her becomes theater, lines recited without conviction. Freud would say this is repression at work, the unconscious censoring what it dares not reveal. In Jungian terms, the shadow swells as words shrink. What is unsaid in a marriage is often more potent than what is spoken. The silence, the vagueness, the over-rehearsed explanations, each is an artifact of a divided self. From the perspective of attachment theory, secure partners share openly because intimacy thrives on vulnerability. But when she cheats, openness becomes dangerous, so she builds walls where bridges once stood. This withdrawal is not accidental, it is protective. She is preserving her secret world from the intrusion of questions. But here lies the bitter irony. Society teaches men that love means listening, being patient, respecting boundaries. Yet sometimes patience is simply complicity in being deceived. Foucault reminds us that silence itself is a form of power. In withholding truth, she asserts dominance over the entire narrative. Her words are no longer meant to connect, but to control. Nietzsche would mock the husband who accepts this erosion, calling him the slave who bows to appearances. To continue smiling through empty conversations is to collude in one's own subjugation. The refusal to speak is not neutrality, it is conquest. The cheating wife wields silence like a weapon, carving space for her hidden double life. And as the dialogue erodes, so does the intimacy it once carried. You begin to realize you are conversing with a mask, not a person. The words that once bound you are now ash in the air. But silence cannot contain passion forever. When dialogue dies, desire seeks a new voice, and the next sign roars through her sudden, restless hunger for intensity. The fifth sign is the hunger for novelty. It arrives disguised as harmless restlessness, new hobbies, new circles, new obsessions. But beneath the surface, it is the old Schopenhauerian truth: the will is never satisfied. Once desire finds a secret outlet, the appetite for novelty becomes insatiable. She is no longer content with the ordinary rhythms of the home. She craves stimulation, disruption, chaos. Jordan Peterson frames this tension as the eternal dance between order and chaos. Marriage represents order, predictability, safety, stability. But erotic energy thrives in chaos, in the forbidden and the unknown. When she starts reaching for chaos in reckless doses, adrenaline trips, late nights, impulsive risks, it is not life she is rediscovering, but the thrill of transgression itself. From an evolutionary standpoint, psychologists describe this as sociosexual orientation, the measure of one's openness to uncommitted encounters. Once she crosses the boundary into infidelity, the dopamine circuits flare. Novelty-seeking behaviors skyrocket, not because of personal growth, but because her brain is being rewired by forbidden stimulation. Affairs are addictive. Novelty is the drug. Jung would insist this is the shadow unleashed, those disowned impulses suddenly ruling her life. Freud might call it sublimation in reverse. Instead of channeling desire into art or work, she channels it into a series of risky escapes, and every escape is a rehearsal for betrayal. Society applauds reinvention, telling women you deserve to explore to feel alive again. But hidden in this slogan is the great hypocrisy. Rarely do they admit that this aliveness is fueled by erotic danger. Esther Perel warns us. What people call falling in love again in affairs is often just falling in love with their own lost vitality, mirrored back by someone new. The hunger for novelty, then, is not innocent. It is the restless scream of the unconscious, the rebellion against the prison of routine. And as it grows, it will demand sacrifice, of honesty, of stability, of you. But novelty alone cannot disguise betrayal. The next sign cuts deeper into the sacred economy of touch, where affection itself becomes currency withheld. The sixth sign is the withholding of touch. Bodies that once reached for each other now recoil. The casual brush of hands, the lingering kiss, the spontaneous embrace, gone, replaced with distance masquerading as fatigue. Schopenhauer warned that desire once consumed curdles into boredom and aversion. When a wife cheats, her body instinctively redirects its energy. Touch becomes a resource she no longer invests at home, because it is being spent elsewhere. Freud would argue this is displacement, the unconscious shifting passion away from the sanctioned object to the forbidden one. What looks like tiredness is often the guilt of erotic energy already spent. Jung would see it as the shadow self dividing the soul. Tenderness reserved for one world, coldness for another. Attachment theory calls this deactivation of affectional bonds. Once a partner invests emotionally and physically in another, the neural circuitry of intimacy begins to rewire. Touch with you no longer soothes, it irritates. The bed becomes not a sanctuary but a courtroom where absence testifies louder than words. Yet here lies the deepest cruelty. She often cloaks this withdrawal in moral superiority. I just need space, you're too needy. By withholding touch, she not only deprives you of intimacy, she shames you for wanting it. Foucault would see this as power exercised through denial. To control when and how affection flows is to dictate the terms of vulnerability. She becomes the warden of the very intimacy you thought was mutual. Jordan Peterson frames intimacy as a stabilizer of chaos within relationships. But when one partner cheats, intimacy at home becomes dangerous, too revealing, too binding. So she shuts the door. She thinks she is protecting her secret, but in reality, she is declaring her absence. Society, of course, will encourage patience. It's just stress, it's hormones, it's life. But touch is never neutral. The absence of it is louder than its presence. When her skin no longer seeks yours, when her lips become polite rather than hungry, you are not sharing a marriage, you are sharing a facade. And what replaces intimacy is not neutrality. The next sign manifests as its twisted inversion, a new aggression, coldness, even contempt. The seventh sign is the birth of contempt. No longer silence, no longer absence, now hostility. Where once there was laughter, there is irritation. Where once there was patience, there is scorn. She mocks, belittles, rolls her eyes. The micro-expressions John Gottman famously identified as the surest predictors of divorce. But philosophy shows us contempt is more than attitude. It is ideology in motion. Nietzsche would call it the morality of the strong disguised as disdain for the weak. In her contempt, she asserts superiority. The husband becomes, in her eyes, the dull shadow of the thrilling other. The man who was once her chosen partner is now her captive audience, the object of ridicule. Her cruelty is not random, it is necessary to justify her betrayal. If she convinces herself he is unworthy, then her infidelity is not treachery but liberation. Freud would see this as projection, the guilt of her double life externalized as anger. Jung might interpret it as shadow inflation, the disowned self bursting out, cloaked in aggression. She despises in him what she cannot yet admit in herself. And Foucault reminds us, contempt is a technology of power. By mocking him, she seizes dominance in the relationship, reshaping its balance in her favor. Evolutionary psychology offers a brutal contempt signals a readiness to trade mates. By degrading her partner, she lowers his perceived value, both to herself and perhaps subconsciously to the social world around them. It is the psychological prelude to replacement. But here lies the bitter paradox. Society often shrugs it off. All couples bicker, all wives nag. This normalization blinds men to the radical shift contempt represents. This is not bickering, it is ideological warfare. It is the conscious or unconscious attempt to dissolve the sacredness of the bond so she can cross into another without shame. When contempt is born, respect dies, and without respect, love has no soil left to grow. But contempt does not remain a private toxin. The eighth and final sign bursts outward, where betrayal becomes visible in the very architecture of her double life. The eighth and final sign is the architecture of the double life. This is no longer whispers, shadows, or subtle withdrawals. It is structure, an entire parallel existence engineered with precision. Foucault taught us that power thrives in systems, in discipline, in the routines that mask subversion. A cheating wife becomes an architect, carefully timed absences, girls' nights, unexplained work trips, alibis rehearsed like scripture. What looks like freedom is actually logistics. Schopenhauer would see in this the will's cruelty, desire constructing elaborate machinery to satisfy itself, indifferent to the suffering it causes. Nietzsche would call it creation through destruction. She is not merely lying, she is building a new reality, a rival order where you are irrelevant. In this secret world, she is sovereign, her lover the co-conspirator, and you the oblivious spectator. Jung might say the double life is the shadow fully embodied, no longer hidden but integrated into daily existence. She is two women now, the dutiful wife at home and the liberated rebel outside it. The oscillation between masks is not chaos, it is performance, an existential theater of bad faith, as Sartre would insist. And yet, in that performance, she feels more alive than in the dull stage of routine fidelity. Evolutionary psychology strips it bare. The dual mating strategy has reached its peak. The nesting partner provides stability, the outsider provides passion. The strategy is not a moral failure, but a reproductive calculus, dressed up in secrecy. Esther Perel adds the cruelest twist. It is not necessarily you she cheats against, it is the version of herself she no longer wants to be. And here is the devastating revelation. The double life is not an accident. It is the triumph of will to power over the myth of monogamy. She is not merely cheating. She is revolting against the entire narrative that promised forever. She is declaring with her actions that permanence is a lie, that desire cannot be caged, that authenticity may demand betrayal. So what do? You cannot unknow the signs. You cannot unsee the architecture. To live in denial is to embrace slavery. To confront it is to reclaim power. The choice is not whether she is guilty. The choice is whether you remain a prisoner of a dying myth, or awaken, tear down the facade, and step into a truth as raw and unforgiving as life itself.